money laundering, nepotism, Epstein's Island are all important parts of Formula 1 that make it a very controversial sport. But from some drivers trying to kill each other to team managers getting caught with their trousers down, I've decided that today I'm going to tell you every single fact and problem with the sport, starting off with this. This is the shitbox known as the Aston Martin. Now, Aston Martin is a team known as one of the greatest at designing terrible cars. For example, during the most recent race in 2026, their car was so shaky to the point where their vibrations were destroying their users' nervous systems. The drivers ended up being slower and in pain throughout the whole race, even to the point where they had to drive with literally no hands. We saw the first of these cars ended up frying themselves mid-race, and the other ended up retiring the car, only to come back from the dead and keep racing, then retire the car again. So what seems to be causing all these massive problems for Aston Martin? Well, currently all of their car troubles have been caused by one very specific engine. Introducing the Honda 1.6-liter V6 engine. And this thing fucking sucks. The whole car that uses this engine shakes so much to the degree that it's slowing them down to the point where their drivers have waved other midfield cars overtaking them. But this isn't the only problem that this team is facing, because the team itself has had problems a lot with its driver lineup. And you're probably wondering why? Well, take a look at this photo. Doesn't one of these drivers look awfully similar to its CEO? Well, this is where we introduce Lawrence Stroll. And if you haven't pieced it together by now, let me draw you a diagram. This here is the Aston Martin lineup, and here is Lawrence Stroll and his wife. When a man and a woman love each other very much, they create one of the most hated F1 drivers to date. So not only is Daddy paying for his Formula 1 seat, but on top of that, he just fucking sucks. This man has no passion for the sport anymore. Well, the only passion he does have actually being that he loves touching tips with other drivers. But then on the other side, we have Fernando Alonso, F1's youngest rookie. Having only driven in Formula 1 for only 20 years or so, he's been a two-time world champion and a pretty good driver in itself. The only problem being, he's arguably the most unlucky driver in F1 history. For example, his championship win in 2007 was completely overshadowed by his team strategy after the Spygate scandal. And then on top of this, he could have been a four-time world champion if he wasn't screwed in 2010 and 2012 for driving for Ferrari. It's actually so bad to the point that he drove for McLaren using the same engine, the Honda, back in like 2015 to 2017, and well, that went well. So coming into 2026, you can imagine Alonso's luck. Not only was this guy led on for the last year by claiming they would have a good car, yet then they came December and suddenly there was a weird shift in dynamic and they began looking more stressed. So when pre-season testing came along, you can imagine his reaction being half a minute slower than everyone else. So in total, Aston Martin are not doing so well, and their fan base are doing even worse. Most of their fan base have always come from their drivers that they've hired into the team, starting with Sebastian Vettel and currently residing with Fernando Alonso. If one of these drivers are doing well, the fan base is happy. Meanwhile, if they're struggling, it might as well be the end of the world. It's so bad to the point, actually, that the people that follow this team have just entirely given up. Actually, as an example, I just asked my friend Dan Noskill what he thinks of the current state of the team, and well, this is what he had to say. And these Aston Martin fans are not the only ones to have given up on their team, as the Ferrari fans have felt this exact pain for 10 years. Over the last 10 years, the Ferrari fan base have been more than halved. And you're probably wondering, well, why is that? Well, that's mainly as a result of them dangling from their bedroom ceilings. Every few weekends, the team would give them hope, kill their sanity, and repeat this cycle till they ended up at the bottom of a water well. The team has had an entire fan base of people that would be great in casinos, because for some reason, they just don't give up. Every weekend, they show up in an absolute swarm of people, only to not even finish the race or finish midfield. So why did they even bother? Well, the main reason is because Ferrari's team is one of the most iconic on the grid. So iconic actually to the point that they're paid $50 million every year for just being in the sport. They joined back in 1950 and have raced all the way to this very current day. They have some insane drivers like Sebastian Vettel, Michael Schumacher, and even Niki Lauda. So with a large number of F1 champions having come from this team, it's safe to say they've got a pretty iconic legacy. The only problem being with this legacy that it's been nearly 15 years since they've shown it. So why are they not winning? Well, the main problem with this team very much lays in their strategy team. The average Ferrari strategy typically consists of gaslighting their drivers.
I broke the wheel.
Copy, we'll check that.
Ruining their tire strategy.
What do I do?
We'll come back to you.
And killing any chance of success with a terrible pit stop.
One lap means only the outlap. We are checking that.
All of this being within 10 minutes of each other. And all of this is being caused by the fact that Ferrari decide to pit at the worst times imaginable. For example, during the Monaco Grand Prix in 2022, they decided to pit both of their cars at the same time, then changed their mind while the driver was already in, and well, this happened.
Box now, box now, box for hard. Stay out, stay out, stay out.
And even though this team has still to this date managed to keep up with the other teams, it doesn't make sense how they have. Well, let's answer that question, because Ferrari have the talent to win championships every single year. Because this year they've hired Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. If you don't know who both of these drivers are, well, I'll say these guys are two of arguably the best drivers in the history of Formula 1. I'm not saying they're the best, but one of them is a literal 7-time world champion. So yeah, they've got pretty good drivers, because Lewis Hamilton joined Ferrari after jumping ship from Mercedes, and since 2025 he's been driving in red. But since 2021, Hamilton's performance has not been the same, especially since you would see 2021 podiums to now seeing pretty much 10th place in a lot of races in 2025. So up to this year, things were not going great for him, to put it lightly. But then came 2026. Somehow Ferrari are currently the second fastest team on the grid, just behind Lewis's former team Mercedes. In China, they managed to steal a podium and got a 3-4 finish with his teammate Charles Leclerc, don't question it, putting them in a pretty solid place in terms of controlling the championship. But actually, speaking of control, someone who's recently gotten way more control of their car is the Haas team, who I don't know how have managed to pull their backmarker car into points. All of that with literally zero funding, and when I mean funding, I mean like dead broke. It's actually so bad that since this team joined the grid, they've had a completely new sponsor every 2 years or so. We've seen everything from MoneyGram to literal fertilizer companies. They take these companies as a result of the large amount of funding they would receive from them, but in exchange for the funding, they would want more control over the team. For example, with the fertilizer company, they wanted a lot more control over the driver lineup, which is where we introduced Nikita Mazepin. His dad was the CEO of this fertilizer company, meaning that daddy basically bought him a seat in F1. So you can tell this team was pretty desperate for money to allow this to happen. And currently this year we have Toyota as a title sponsor, so we'll have to wait and see if that works out. But being honest with you, it feels like this team is a big sellout. If you were to ask the Haas team to choose between a gay son and a thought daughter, technically they wouldn't have to choose because they got both. The both of which being in their two drivers who have some confusing portfolios to say the least. We have Esteban Ocon, who is French, so I hate him, and also Oliver Behrman. Now, as much as I hate their driver Ocon, I have to give this guy credit, as he has a pretty crazy track record for the rain. For some reason, when the heavens begin to piss on track, Esteban changes his style and becomes something of a strategy god, and not only that, but in certain situations, his French pride comes out, and instead of riding, he's been known to play human bowling in the pit lane. And then we also have our little edgelord Ollie Behrman. Now, Behrman is a very interesting young man, as he says, well, whatever's on his mind. So during the 2025 season, we saw some leaked Discord messages from a few years back discussing some of the current drivers of the grid. For example, like how Oscar Piastri is a genetically modified human. But then on top of these DMs, we saw some messages about his opinions about drivers that were taking a little bit out of context, including some interesting DMs to say the least. So it's safe to say that this team has needed its fair share of branding and PR work. However, this year it's going to be needed, especially with the introduction of Toyota Racing. While this team was supporting Haas as a technical partner since about 2024, they decided in 2026 this was the perfect year to step in with funding. They thought it would be a smart gamble to invest in a midfield team at best, and somehow it worked. As of writing this, after the Chinese Grand Prix, they are somehow in fucking 4th. They're even beating Red Bull. What the fuck? Speaking of which, we need to talk about this Red Bull shitbox. But before we continue about the Red Bull, I think it's important that we briefly mention NordVPN, who actually chose to sponsor this video of all of them. Since I work online a lot of my days, NordVPN has basically been a huge detrimental part of my life. Whenever I use NordVPN, whether I'm opening unsafe links to protect my location, or people wanting to install things like the Bobbyware on my PC, I have to be protected, which is exactly where NordVPN comes in. It's really simple to use with just a single click, and I'm connected to their servers almost instantly. Thanks to Nord, my IP address is hidden and my internet traffic is encrypted. It also helps me connect to my paid subscriptions so that I can actively watch F1 when I'm out of the country for work trips. So since they have servers in the UK and Ireland, for example, I can access the site that I stream F1 on. Also, since their servers are super fast, it means I just won't lose any quality on these streams. Also, since editor Philip has to do most of these videos in a different country, NordVPN is basically protecting both of our computers with their MeshNet functionality, which is allowing us to send files around the the world that we collaborate on. So go check out nordvpn.com/sketchy for an exclusive 4-month free offer that you're not going to find anywhere else, I can assure you. I had to push hard for this, guys. You can try NordVPN for completely free for 30 days with no risk. And if you don't like it, well, you'll get your money back guaranteed. But I'm pretty sure you'll love it. So check it out over on nordvpn.com/sketchy. Thank you, NordVPN, for sponsoring. And let's talk about this shitbox of a Red Bull car. Holy fuck. See, this here is the state of Red Bull in 2026. And this car in particular is causing them a lot of problems. In 2026, Red Bull split ways with their partners in Honda, who, well, went on to better things at Aston Martin. And this year, instead, they chose to switch angles and take a partnership with Ford. As of right now, the car has been struggling with pace, to say the least. And they're currently sat in P5 in the constructors, which is not usual, to say the least. And all previous strong results were all caused by one singular man known as... This guy is so beyond good on the grid to the point where people want him to be in other divisions of racing. And what makes Max's personality even more interesting is the fact that he just doesn't care anymore. He just wants to fucking race cars, man. After losing the championship last year, his perspective completely changed. And also, after having a kid would do that too. But as a result of Max being so good, this team has been dominant in the last 5 seasons today. So why this year of all is this team struggling so much? Well, the team has not been the same since the departure of Adrian Newey, who decided of all teams he was going to leave to, he went to Aston Martin. And it was an interesting choice, as it turns out, because as a result of him leaving Red Bull, you could tell where they were struggling. And since the 2023 season, we've seen 3 drivers leave and enter this team as a result of their car just not being strong enough to compete. We first had Liam Lawson, who got sent back to their sister team. Then we had Yuki Tsunoda, who got shipped back to Japan. And currently, we now have Isaac Hadjar, who is, he's having a rough season, to say the least. So if this team is struggling so much, how is Max Verstappen able to keep winning? Well, the answer is that for the last few years, he's been driving that car like it's the last time he'll ever race. And instead of fixing the problems, Red Bull kind of just said, he's winning though, even though it's clear that he's struggling. And what's even worse is their strategy is clearly not working this year because the cars for 2026 are very much designed to try pace themselves throughout the whole lap, meaning that Max isn't able to overdrive the car like he was able to in previous years. So this is a season that's a little rough for this team, to say the least. But they're not the only ones struggling. That's because the Williams F1 team is in dire straits right now. Williams is one of the most historic teams in the entirety of F1, having introduced some of the greatest drivers in the world. However, this team is just broke. Unlike the other teams on the grid, Williams is a pure racing team, so money is not so easy for them. The term pure racing team basically means that it's not necessarily a car company that's funding it, like for example McLaren, Ferrari, all of those kind of companies, and instead it's actually just a pure racing team that's dedicated to racing. But however, they do have a title sponsor in Atlassian, and as a result they get base funding amounts given to them that's just enough to get by. However, last year they got P5 in a Constructors Championship, so surely they'd have enough money to develop for the future, right? Well, then came the 2026 season, and lord, this team are back to square one on fuels. We've seen them struggle a lot with reliability performance from these new regulations, and it's tough to know entirely what happened to the team, especially since they promised fans that good performance was going to be normal from now on. Yep, here we are, and both cars are out in SQ1 in China. And what's worse is that it's very difficult to believe that these cars just suddenly got slower by adding 30 kilograms of weight to the car. It's hard to imagine that this car is just performing worse because of a little bit of added weight. It doesn't make sense. So the team themselves, as a result, are just disjointed right now. But there is one thing this team has been doing right, to be fair to them, and that is clear in their driver lineup. If you don't know, last season Williams saw the introduction of Carlos Sainz, who was replaced at Ferrari by Lewis Hamilton. But since the start of last season, he didn't have the power to compete with other teams. It took a while for the car's tuning to be closer to what he would have wanted. By the middle of the season, he definitely had what was closer to what he would have wanted. And hey, he even had the midfield almost completely won. He was even improving so much to the point that he got a podium twice in a single season, which is insane for a Williams driver. If you look back at their past over the last few years, their points have been pretty bad except for last season. So So this is kind of like a Carlos Sainz effect in my opinion, because when you look at, for example, when he raced at McLaren, he basically exceeded his car's capability non-stop. But heck, not only was Carlos entrusted, but alongside him we've got Alex Albon, who's honestly one of the best midfield drivers in the grid. Now Albon is one of those drivers who tend to be a ghost in most races. You kind of barely ever see him doing anything extravagant, but one thing he does do is pull consistent results for the team over and over again. After getting kicked to the curb by the Red Bull main team, he evacuated straight away to Williams, and since then he's basically been the entire heartbeat of this team. So if there's one thing this team knows, it's how to scout incredible talent. Heck, these are also the kind of individuals who brought Nicholas Latifi in to drive for them when he pulled this incredible move, managing to pass all the drivers in front of him in just one corner, alongside the safety car. But Williams are not the only ones seeing a spot of bother, because Racing Bulls are in the exact same boat as them. The Racing Bulls are known as one of the greatest producers in the history of F1. Well, that was until they spunked out this season's results. This year they decided to keep their current driver Liam Lawson, as well as a new rookie called Arvid Lindblad. Now Arvid has been a very interesting kid, as he's extremely young and climbed his way up on his own in the junior classes as a result of the Red Bull team wanting him immediately. So it's very obvious this kid has a lot of potential. However, the potential seems to also have its downsides too. If you don't know, Arvid is known for having a very focused and aggressive style, meaning that when things don't go his way, things can get a little more intense. For example, when he drove in Monza in F2, he took out not one but two drivers during the race. And now of course it wasn't intentional, but it's this laser focus and aggressive driving style that causes drivers a lot of problem. Heck, even if you look at the Japanese Grand Prix as of writing this now, the defending he was doing against Isaac Hajar was pretty intense. It kind of reminded me of like a younger Max Verstappen when he was in his 2015 season. I think it was 2015. So he's got a pretty promising future ahead of him. And typically when drivers like Arvid are promoted to Racing Bulls, their whole point is to help them get in practice and get good fundamentals built into their driving style. Yet sometimes these drivers just don't get enough time to develop these skills, kind of like similar to his teammate Liam Lawson, because Liam Lawson was one of those prodigy rookies that was introduced as a driver in 2014 to replace Daniel Ricciardo. He was pretty strong in the junior leagues of racing as well, and in his first season at Racing Bulls, he had a pretty extremely strong stint for the team. But then coming into 2025, they decided to promote him to the main Red Bull team, and then after two races, just demoted him back. They literally gave him two chances, and they kicked him back to the curb to replace him with his friend. A friend that now he's just tainted his relationship with. And not only is the driver lineup shaky, but the entire team as a whole are too. This year, the team has been struggling a lot with pace. And what's funnier about it is that the fact that the Racing Bulls team is going through the same growing pains that the main team is going through, meaning that this team are not going to be in a good place for this season. Currently, as a result of this, they're stuck in around P6, P7 in the Constructors' Championship, and will most likely stay there till they change the car. But speaking of changing the car, we 100% need to talk about Alpine, who in the Chinese Grand Prix showed us one of the greatest performances in a very long time. We see one of their drivers, Ft.Gassy, driving some incredible races since the start of the season. In fact, he's driving so well that he's even surpassed Max Verstappen. On top of their current talent, they've been trying to build up their junior team. And the surprising part is that they're actually moving pretty well. In their development teams, we can see drivers like Alex Studd shining in F2, especially after moving from McLaren. I'm totally not biased because he's Irish, and I definitely didn't buy Alpine merch as a result of him signing, because they're French and I hate French people. But to be honest with you, this team's operational style is pretty brutal. In the last few years, we've seen the introduction of Flavio Briatore to the team, and the results have been brutal in simple terms. In the world of being an Alpine driver, if you don't perform, you're pretty much gone. Most of their drivers have seen as expendable to the team, and they don't tend to last very long as a result of that. We saw last season this exact issue when we saw the introduction of a rookie by the name of Jack Doohan, for him to be replaced very early in the season and then get death threats because of a fucking Twitter page. They then introduced Franco Colapinto, who struggled a lot with the car last season, and he ended up getting this cutthroat treatment directly from Flavio in the middle of the season, and we watched it literally publicized to the general audience on Netflix. So to be blunt, this team just don't care what others think of them. In their eyes, they'll replace as many drivers as they need in order to get the lineup they are looking for. But speaking of replacements as well, it's impossible not to discuss Audi replacing the Kick-Sauber F1 team. Now, Audi are one of the two new teams to enter F1 this year, as they bought the strangest team on the grid this year. After making this large purchase of the Kick-Sauber team, they renovated their whole infrastructure and built their own engine to prepare for it. But being blunt, the choice to buy Kick-Sauber was an interesting one to say the least, especially since Kick is arguably one of the strangest teams to have ever existed in F1 history. Most people find it ironic that cigarette companies and alcohol sponsors are completely banned in F1, but on the other side, Plinko. On top of that, it's a gambling site that sponsors Kick, which is the home of Jack Doherty and Aiden Ross. So definitely an ethical company. However, the team itself actually ended up being one of the stronger teams last year, mainly as a result of their incredibly talented drivers. Their talent was in fact so good that this year the team actually decided to keep the exact same drivers. That's actually been working out better than people realized it would. Their newer talent comes in the form of Gabriel Bortoleto, who was a pretty young rookie from Brazil. His season last year at Kick was pretty troublesome as the car was struggling in corners quite a lot. But then came the new Audi car and the control seems to have improved a lot more. Gabriel actually shined his way through F2 in 2024 and won the whole thing, so to say he's a rising talent is actually kind of an understatement. What's funnier is that the second driver, Nico Hulkenberg, is arguably one of the more experienced drivers in F1, a driver who actually happens to hold the F1 record for the most races without a podium finish. This record lasted for his entire career all the way till last season, where he somehow did it. During the Silverstone Grand Prix, he managed to pull off a masterpiece and get his first career podium after pulling off a strategy that would leave a lot of people skeptical. So if you're new to the sport, Audi is definitely a team to support, but just be very wary if you do that, because they're not the only new team that joined this year, because Cadillac are the other team who joined with two drivers who had actually left the grid after getting kicked out of their previous teams. Right now for the Cadillac team, we have Sergio Perez, who was let go from Red Bull in 2024, as well as Valtteri Bottas, who was released from his seat in Kick Sauber and Formula Mercedes. So it's easy to say this team took a large gamble on their two drivers, and unfortunately that gamble has not been paying off for them recently. Sergio, for example, had a crash in Japan with Alex Albon, as well as Valtteri having problems with the car's reliability. So what are they doing wrong? Well, this season they've been struggling especially with these new regulations. They decided to enter this year with a Ferrari power unit, who we told you is not so good at that stuff. And on top of that, the car itself has a pretty weak infrastructure. The team itself feels like it's got no soul right now, and the drivers kind of look like they really couldn't give a shit. It's the equivalent of taking a shit and just not wiping, and this team is completely new, so it's kind of hard to discuss them a lot right now, but by the end of the season, we should see them develop a little more. However, until then, we're just gonna have to wait and see. But someone on the complete flip side of that is Mercedes. Mercedes are one of the teams on the grid that have caused a lot of problems coming into the 2026 season. With their car being absolutely dominant with their engine schemes, it's safe to say that this team is a very large contender for the year. But if they were to keep the way they're driving, they may see a brighter future with the introduction of their driver lineup. Coming into 2025, they've introduced their updated lineup, featuring George Russell and Kimi Antonelli, forming what we now call Al Mercedes. These guys crashed a lot into other drivers, including some famous ones like the Dutch Grand Prix last year, where we saw the introduction of Kimi Antonelli. But we can't talk about him without discussing Osama bin Russell. Russell is one of the most interesting drivers on the grid, who in most situations looks like an alien. If you don't believe me, well then just watch this.
What love do you expect? Someone at North Box.
Now, not only is this guy extraterrestrial, but I'm certain that he needs glasses because he just doesn't seem to understand the idea of being on the wrong side of a road. On top of that, he's just very much known as the guy who has a fair share of issues with drivers on the grid and gets very steamy pretty quick. Literally. Oh. Especially with a fellow driver called Max Verstappen that we've discussed earlier, because in previous seasons they just not like each other at all. They just didn't. It was actually so bad to the point that in 2024 at the F1 dinner, Russell purposely sat on the other side of the table just to avoid talking to Max. So not only is this guy just trying to tell a story that Max is guilty, but in reality 90% of the time Russell's just in denial and it's his fault. So what's left? Pretty much a driver that might as well have dementia. And then on the other side we have Kimi Antonelli, who's basically just a living fetus in the F1 space. This man is only 19 and winning races, so it's pretty obvious that this kid is talented. So talented actually to the point where people think this kid will be the next Max Verstappen. Now, call me crazy for stating the obvious, but Mercedes putting all their future on this one kid is kind of insane. But this kid is promising to say the least. Currently, he is leading the championship, being one of the youngest in F1 in history to do so. So to say he'll dominate in the future is definitely in the cards. But if we're talking about dominance, we need to talk about McLaren because they are insane. McLaren over the last few years was one of the best teams on the grid, especially with the fact that they have two talented drivers in two insanely fast cars. And what's better for them was last season they had a better car for the regulation period than most of the other teams on the grid. So why isn't this team first right now? Well, it's basically because the car currently sucks. Actually, the whole team dynamic just swallows. Their logic for the drivers is that they've two drivers that they put their full priority in. Wait, that makes no sense, because what if both of them want to win the Drivers' Championship? Well, this is where we introduce how dumb this team is. They invented their own rules called the Papaya rules, which are essentially a bunch of bullshit rules saying they have to prioritize the team before the Drivers' Championship, as well as both drivers getting equally fair treatment. Does that work? Well, absolutely fucking not. In fact, it was actually so bad to the point that the drivers nearly hated each other by the end of the season. So how has this team survived as long as it has? Well, McLaren have actually been on the grid for a while. Actually, so long to the point where they're almost as historic as Ferrari. They've won multiple championships in their prime and are even given $30 million as a bonus for being in the sport. However, this team over the last few years has struggled. At one point about 5 years ago, they were so bad to the point they were averaging P15 in the grid. And the common error with all of these seasons was how bad their cars been designed. McLaren are notorious when it comes to designing these bad cars. Even this year, they're struggling to keep up with other teams. So what is making the cars themselves, not just for McLaren, but every team on the grid so far, is so bad? Well, I'll let Gassy explain that. That's his thing.
Every single car is made out of 4 key components. First, we have ICE, otherwise known as the internal combustion engine. Next, we have the MGU, which is basically a powerful electric motor that's connected to the wheels. And then you can't forget about the battery. It's basically 2 AAAs that sit right under the driver's seat. Last but not least is the fuel tank, which basically puts the fuel in a tank for the car. Without even one of these things, the car would just not move and would be as useful as Ferrari's strategy team.
Is there leakage?
A leakage of what?
I have the seat full of water.
Must be the water. Must be the water.
All of these parts are vital to F1 in general, because if you have bad parts, chances are you'll have a bad car too. So you can imagine these parts are pretty important, right? Well, for the past few years, the FIA, who creates the rules, decided they wanted to shift these car parts towards being more sustainable. How could they do this? Well, by introducing new rules to all of the teams, they can enforce the car regulations to make them more eco-friendly. So basically like paper straws and stuff in the cars. That's awesome, right? Well, the FIA were criticized heavily for these changes, as it made the cars a lot less raw like they used to be. But then this year in 2026, they did something similar, but made it even worse.
Worse than paper straws.
In 2026, the cars have now almost entirely been changed, so it's now a 50-50 split between battery and engine power, meaning they basically turn these cars from Audis into glorified Priuses. So people did what they do and started yapping on Twitter, only to be hidden by F1 themselves with over 1,000 hidden replies. So why even try to change the engines when people clearly hate it? Well, the whole purpose of these new regulations is to introduce this new feature that makes the racing feel more like Mario Kart instead of F1. This feature being called the manual override, and basically it's just a fucking boost button. That's literally all it is. The racers say it feels like the mushrooms from Mario Kart. Now, of course, these batteries would usually run out of juice after one turn, but this is where Formula 1 engines get pretty insane. These cars somehow manage to capture the wasted energy when a driver brakes to take a corner. And the MGU we discussed earlier acts as a weird generator, soaking up all of the heat and motion to recharge the car's battery for the next straight. So it's this insane tech that allows the driver to use the boost button to dump all of the power they have at once. The whole purpose of this is to make overtaking other cars based on skill and their energy management, rather than having a faster car. In theory, it's a great system, but in reality, we're learning this change just sucks. The opening lap of the first race of the season was interesting. However, there's no point in being interested for only 15 laps, and for the rest of the session, barely anyone moving position. There are some positives to all this. The cars technically become cheaper to produce, allowing the teams an easier entry point to the sport, as well as fuels being eco-friendly and sustainable. So there are some positives, but those positives are hidden under so many negatives to the point where it kind of sucks to watch. There is this one thing that does save it all, and that is the fun of aerodynamics. Under the old rules in F1, the cars featured something called DRS, which was a flap on the back of the car that would reduce drag. In this year's Formula 1, the car changes its shape completely. There are 2 aerodynamic modes, being the Z mode and the X mode. Z mode essentially is when both of the wings are completely closed, and the car has more downforce and a stronger grip in the corners. But in X mode, the driver can flip the wings and reduce the drag of the car by 55%, allowing the car to become way quicker. And it's all up to the drivers and teams themselves to find a strategy that works well with the car, which is a huge part of F1.
I couldn't have said better myself, Gassy, if I wanted to. But I'm gonna talk about something completely different. I know it's late in the video, but it's important you guys also understand what strategy is in F1, because if you don't understand strategy, you're not gonna understand how F1 works. The margin of error in Formula 1 is pretty fucking small, but these little margins are what differences winners versus losers. So a lot of these teams introduce strategies for these errors that we call undercuts or overcuts. We're mainly gonna focus about the undercut because it's the most common one, but if you want to watch videos on overcut, just Google it. But the undercut is the most common race strategy in F1, as it's one of the most effective methods of getting past an opponent. The undercut, to people that know what it is essentially a strategy where someone goes into the pits, gets a new set of tires, and they're basically fresher, which allows them to blast past other drivers who are in the pits. So essentially, the fresher your tires are, the quicker you go. So how does that work? Well, it's important you understand that F1 tires come in 3 breeds. We have the soft tire, which is the red circle on the wheels. These tires are the fastest of the 3, and since these tires have more grip to the ground, it allows the tire to get higher traction, meaning the driver is able to have faster cornering, braking, acceleration, etc. However, as a result of these tires being stickier, the rubber and the tires end up melting a lot quicker than the other tires, making these tires great for very short periods of time. But then we have the medium tires, which are kind of a yellow circle and are more balanced of the tires. So although the rubber on these tires lasts a little longer, they tend to also be a little slower, as they don't have as much grip to the tarmac because of the toughness of the rubber. So these tires are great for kind of a longer stint race, but the longest lasting ones are the hard tire, and these tires have the white circle on the rim, and they're the strongest by far for long stints. These tires tend to be a lot slower from the start off, but since they're slower to start, they end up lasting longer over half of the race distance, meaning in most cases you only have to pit once throughout the whole race. Most teams tend to go from medium tires onto the hard tire depending on the track, mainly because it allows for the potential of the undercut, as well as the fast pace in the beginning of the race. Then the longer you go into the race, the more dispersed the cars are, and it means that you have more gaps to fit in after your pit stop. That is pretty much how the undercut strategy works, but a lot of teams just aren't able to do them. For example, Ferrari, we mentioned earlier, is shit. However, the rule changes this year are making these tire strategies a little different, especially with the fact that the car's aerodynamics are a little different. Since those flaps on the car now move, the tires are getting hit with different amounts of wind and heat every second, meaning that hypothetically, if the drivers were to push too hard in corner mode of the car, they might end up just cooking their tires in 2 laps. We've actually already begun to see these examples of the tire degrading with, like, for example, in Ferrari, where the battles in China were actually damaging their tires a lot more than they expected. So in total, strategy, very important for F1. In terms of F1, how do you win? I've just realized we haven't talked about that. It's very important. At its most basic level, cars race around racing circuits 24 times a year on different weekends in different countries. This usually spans from March to December, giving a 4-month break for the winter period. Then, on top of the 24 races, the season is also split into 2. The first half being from the start in March all the way till August. Then we get a month break. Then we finish the rest of the season into December. Where we race each year is also subject to change, but most seasons we race in a few set tracks like Monaco and Silverstone. For every week, we have a different structured weekend, but most of them follow this format. We get 3 practice sessions, 1 qualifying session, and 1 race session. I know that doesn't mean a whole lot to you right now, but I'll explain it to you. In the 3 free practice sessions we get given, it is essentially a set amount of time that drivers have to practice their cars on a track. During this time, they get to practice their pit stops and get a grip of how the track actually feels to drive on. Then we find our way into qualifying, where drivers get 3 sessions on track, around 18 minutes, 15, and then finally 12 on track. And the whole goal is for them to clock the fastest lap they can. For the first session, we usually see the bottom 6 get eliminated. Then in the next session, we see the next 6 get eliminated, and then we're left with the last 10. Whoever is fastest starts first. So basically, however fast you go is how you start the race. Then the actual race is what matters for points. Where you finish in the race is how many points you receive. So first place gets 25 points, second gets 18, and third gets 15, etc. And then on occasional weekends, it's where it gets complicated because sometimes we have something called called the sprint race, which is basically a 25% of the length of an actual race kind of race, and you get extra points based on the position you find yourself there. And all these sprint races only happen on these locations on screen. So now that we've figured out all of that, how does it work? Across these 24 races, points are awarded in the races, and whichever driver has most points wins the season. It's really simple. But the drivers aren't just fighting for themselves, but also their teams. So basically, if both cars don't cross the line in a decent position, then it's going to be pretty detrimental for the team. So for example, when Ferrari drives most weekends, they show pace, then the car pins itself, or they do it themselves. They lose out on a lot of points from a result of that. So it's super important they finish well. The team in the sports are also typically fighting for the Constructors' Championship, which is the most important of the two championships. I say two because there's two championships running at the same time. I know it's really complicated. I'm sorry. I'm trying my best to explain this, but basically the teams in F1 are fighting for a Constructors' Championship. They add the two drivers' points together. That's how many points the team has per race. Then the drivers themselves have their own separate version of that. The championship for the constructors is the difference between the team getting a couple $1 million and even 100 million. And that is basically Formula 1 explained in I don't know how many minutes this is. I'll be so honest with you. But please, if you can, subscribe. Check out the link in the description to help me out with NordVPN. Also, we're on Spotify right now. It would mean so much if you could watch these videos on Spotify because it helps fund these videos a lot more. And NordVPN are also helping there. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. I know it's a long one, but thank you, Gassy, for coming, and click the video on screen.